The gunshot echoed through the valley as Lillian Hayes ducked behind the weathered counter of her roadside diner, her heart thundering against her ribs. It was 1876 in the unforgiving New Mexico territory, and trouble had just walked in wearing dusty boots in desperation. The morning had started like any other quiet, with the scent of fresh biscuits and coffee wafting through her modest establishment. Nestled at the crossroads between Silver City and nowhere important, Lillian's diner saw its fair share of drifters, miners, and cowboys passing through. But none quite like the man who'd just collapsed against her door, blood seeping through his shirt. "Madam," he rasped, his voice like gravel, "I believe I'm in a spot of trouble." Lillian moved swiftly, locking the door behind him before drawing the curtains. At 26, she'd learned that survival in the West required quick thinking and even quicker hands. "You're bleeding all over my floor," she said, helping him to a chair. His face was streaked with trail dust, but beneath it she could see sharp features framed by dark hair that curled at the edges. "My apologies." He grimaced as she eased him down. "Wasn't planning on getting shot today." Outside, hoofbeats thundered past, accompanied by angry shouts. Lillian held her breath until they faded into the distance. "Looks like you've made some friends," she said dryly, reaching for a clean rag. "I'm going to need to see that wound." The stranger nodded, unbuttoning his shirt with shaking fingers to reveal a bloody gash along his ribs where a bullet had grazed him. "I'm Vaughn," he said through gritted teeth. "Vaughn Blackwood." Lillian worked in silence, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made him hiss and clench his jaw. His eyes, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, followed her movements. "You've done this before," he observed. "My pa was a doctor before the fever took him. I picked up a few things." She pressed a clean bandage to his side. "What kind of trouble are you in, Mr. Blackwood?" "The kind that follows you." His expression darkened. "I won crossing a man who doesn't like to lose." Lillian tied off the bandage and stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, you can't go anywhere like this. There's a back room with a cot. You can rest there until those men move on." Vaughn looked at her with something like surprise. "Why would you help me? You don't know me from Adam." Lillian shrugged. "Maybe I've seen too many men die already." She moved to the stove, pouring a cup of coffee and setting it before him. "Drink this. You look like you could use it." He wrapped his hands around the steaming mug, inhaling deeply before taking a sip. Something passed across his face, an emotion Lillian couldn't quite name. "No one's ever fed me and asked nothing in return," the cowboy said as she poured his coffee. Lillian felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. "Well, I wouldn't say nothing. You'll have to tell me why those men want you dead while I make you breakfast." For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "That's a fair trade." And so began the most dangerous week of Lillian Hayes' life. By noon, Lillian had learned that Vaughn Blackwood was a former Texas Ranger turned bounty hunter who'd been tracking a notorious gang leader named Isaiah Calhoun. He'd caught up with him in a card game in Silver City, where Vaughn had won not only Calhoun's money, but also a mysterious map the outlaw had been desperate to keep. "So what's on this map that's worth killing for?" Lillian asked as she chopped vegetables for stew, keeping an eye on the road through the window. Vaughn sat at her small kitchen table, examining his torn shirt. "Gold. Or at least that's what Calhoun believes. It supposedly leads to an abandoned Spanish mine in the Mogollon Mountains." "And does it?" Lillian glanced over her shoulder at him. He shrugged, wincing at the movement. "Haven't had time to find out. Been too busy staying alive." "Where is it now?" Vaughn tapped his temple. "Safe. I memorized it and burned the original." He gave her a measuring look. "You're taking all this rather calmly, Miss Hayes." Lillian tossed the vegetables into the pot. "I've been running this place alone for 3 years since Pa died. You learn not to ruffle easily." "No husband?" Vaughn asked, then quickly added, "I apologize. That's not my business." "No husband," she confirmed. "Had a fiancé once. James rode off to find his fortune in the gold fields and never came back." She stirred the pot with more force than necessary. "Later heard he found a wealthy widow in San Francisco instead." Vaughn's expression darkened. "Some men don't deserve the women who wait for them." Lillian shook her head. "I wasn't waiting. This diner is mine. I built it from almost nothing after Pa died. I don't need a man to make my way." She set down her spoon and faced him. "But I do need to stay alive, so I should know how many men are after you." Calhoun travels with 5 men. Mean as rattlesnakes, every one of them. Vaughn leaned forward, his face serious. Miss Hayes, I shouldn't have brought this trouble to your door. As soon as night falls, I'll move on. With that wound, you wouldn't make it 5 miles. Lillian crossed her arms. Besides, they've already passed through. Likely they think you continued on toward Silver City. A knock at the front door made them both freeze. Lillian motioned for Vaughn to stay put as she wiped her hands and moved to the entrance, composing her features into a neutral expression before opening the door. A tall man with a sheriff's badge stood on her porch, hat in hand. Afternoon, Miss Hayes. Sheriff Wilson. Lillian nodded, keeping her body positioned to block the view inside. What brings you out this way? Looking for a man who might have passed through. Tall fellow, dark hair, probably wounded. Name's Blackwood. The sheriff's eyes scanned what little he could see of the diner. He's wanted for questioning about a shooting in Silver City. Lillian raised an eyebrow. Plenty of drifters passed through, Sheriff. Can't say I recall anyone matching that description today. Sheriff Wilson studied her face. This man's dangerous, Miss Hayes. If you see him, you send word immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself. Of course, Sheriff. She forced a smile. Would you like some coffee? Just brewed a fresh pot. He shook his head. Can't today. Gotta keep looking. Calhoun's offering a hefty reward for information on this fella. Isaiah Calhoun. Lillian couldn't hide her surprise. I thought he was an outlaw himself. He is, the sheriff said grimly. But he's got friends in high places and gold to spread around. Makes some people forget his past transgressions. He settled his hat back on his head. You be careful, Miss Hayes. Lock your doors tonight. After the sheriff departed, Lillian returned to the kitchen, her mind racing. Vaughn stood by the window, watching the lawman ride away. The sheriff's in Calhoun's pocket, he said flatly. That complicates things. Lillian sagged into a chair. You didn't tell me you were accused of shooting someone. It was self-defense. Vaughn turned to face her. One of Calhoun's men drew on me first. There were witnesses, but... He shrugged. Money talks louder than honest folk in these parts. So now the law is hunting you too. Lillian massaged her temples. Perfect. I'll leave after dark, Vaughn insisted. I've brought enough trouble, and go where? Lillian cut him off. With the sheriff and Calhoun's men searching every trail? No. She stood, decision made. There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen. It's small, but it'll hide you until things quiet down. Vaughn stared at her. Why would you risk yourself for me? Lillian wasn't entirely sure of the answer herself. Perhaps it was the loneliness of the past 3 years, or the honesty she sensed in his eyes, or simply the fact that she'd grown tired of watching the world take from those who had little to give. Let's just say I have my reasons, she replied. Now eat your stew before it gets cold. That night, after settling Vaughn in the hidden cellar and checking his wound, Lillian lay awake in her bed above the diner, listening to the sounds of the desert night. Helping an injured stranger was one thing, harboring a man wanted by both outlaws, and the law was another entirely. She could lose everything, her diner, her reputation, perhaps even her life. Yet something about Vaughn Blackwood's story rang true, and in a world where justice often bent toward those with the deepest pockets, Lillian found herself unwilling to simply turn him away. Morning brought a new challenge. Lillian usually opened the diner for breakfast, serving the occasional traveler and the handful of regulars from the nearby homesteads. Closing without explanation would only raise suspicions. She rose early, checking on Vaughn before preparing for the day. He was feverish but alert, the wound showing no signs of infection. I need to open today, she told him, changing his bandage. Otherwise, people will talk. You stay hidden, no matter what you hear. He caught her wrist gently. Lillian, if Calhoun's men return, I can handle myself, she assured him, trying not to notice how her name sounded in his low voice. I keep a shotgun under the counter. The morning passed uneventfully. A few travelers stopped for coffee and eggs, and old Mr. Jenkins from the neighboring farm came by with fresh eggs, as he did every Wednesday. Lillian found herself jumping at every sound, her eyes constantly darting to the window whenever horses approached. Shortly after noon, the door swung open, and Lillian's blood froze. 3 men entered dusty, armed, and carrying the unmistakable air of trouble. The tallest wore an expensive coat despite the heat, his dark beard neatly trimmed, a gold watch chain dangling across his vest. The other two flanked him like hounds, eyes constantly scanning the room. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Lillian said, keeping her voice steady. "What can I get for you?" The bearded man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Coffee for now, miss. And perhaps some information." He settled onto a stool at the counter, removing his hat to reveal slicked back hair. "I'm Isaiah Calhoun. These are my associates, Jenks and Rowe." Lillian nodded, turning to pour coffee to hide her expression. "Passing through, looking for someone," Calhoun said smoothly. "A thief who took something valuable of mine. Sheriff says he might have come this way." Lillian set the coffee before him. "Many travelers stop here. I can't say I recall anyone suspicious." Calhoun studied her face. This man would have been wounded, possibly desperate. Hard to miss. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Mr. Calhoun." Lillian wiped down the counter, acutely aware of the cellar door hidden beneath the rug in the kitchen behind her. "But you're welcome to enjoy your coffee." The man called Jenks wandered toward the kitchen doorway. "Nice little place you got here. You run it all alone?" "I do." Lillian moved to block his path. "The kitchen's not open to customers, sir." Calhoun watched the exchange with calculating eyes. "My friend is just admiring your establishment, Mississippi." "Hayes. Lillian Hayes." "Miss Hayes." Calhoun sipped his coffee. "Tell me, what would you do if you discovered someone had stolen from you? Something irreplaceable." Lillian met his gaze evenly. "I suppose I'd ask myself why they took it, and whether I had any right to it in the first place." A dangerous smile played at Calhoun's lips. A philosophical answer. "But theft is theft, wouldn't you agree?" "Not always," Lillian replied. "Some say the Spanish stole gold from these mountains that never belonged to them. Others say the land itself was stolen from those who lived here first." Calhoun's eyes hardened. "You speak your mind freely, Miss Hayes. It's my establishment. I can afford to." The tension in the room thickened. Jenks had returned to Calhoun's side, whispering something in his ear. The outlaw nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Lillian's face. "We'll be staying in town for a few days," Calhoun finally said, placing coins on the counter. "I'm sure we'll become better acquainted." He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "If you happen to remember anything about our missing friend, there's good money in it for information." After they left, Lillian locked the door and leaned against it, her heart racing. She hurried to the cellar, finding Vaughn already standing at the bottom of the ladder, gun drawn. "That was Calhoun," she whispered, climbing down. "He knows you're here." Vaughn holstered his weapon. "You can't be certain. I can see it in his eyes, the way they were looking around." Lillian paced the small space. "You can't stay here. They'll come back, and next time they won't just ask questions." Vaughn ran a hand through his hair. "I can't just leave you to face them. And I can't have you shot dead in my cellar," Lillian countered. "We need a plan." They spoke in hushed tones as Lillian tended to his wound. The fever had broken, and though he was still weak, Vaughn could travel if necessary. By nightfall, they had formulated a desperate plan. Under the cover of darkness, Lillian loaded supplies into a small wagon she used for trips to town. She harnessed her sturdy mare, Agnes, and helped Vaughn climb aboard, concealing him beneath canvas and supplies. "I'll tell anyone who asks that I'm visiting my cousin in Lordsburg," Lillian explained, checking that the shotgun was loaded before placing it within reach. "We'll take the old mining road. It's longer but less traveled." Vaughn caught her hand. "You're risking everything for a stranger." "What?" Lillian paused, the question catching her off guard. In truth, Vaughn Blackwood no longer felt like a stranger. In the days he'd spent hidden in her home, she'd come to know him, his principles, his quiet strength, the way his eyes crinkled when he finally smiled. "Maybe I'm tired of letting men like Calhoun decide who deserves justice," she said finally. "Or maybe I just have poor judgment when it comes to handsome, wounded cowboys." A smile ghosted across his face. "When this is over, I'll find a way to repay you. Let's focus on staying alive first," Lillian replied, climbing onto the wagon seat. With a click of her tongue, she set Agnes in motion, guiding the wagon away from the only home she'd known for years, toward an uncertain future with a man she barely knew. The old mining road twisted through rugged terrain, skirting the foothills of the mountains. They traveled through the night, stopping only when necessary to rest the horse or for Vaughn to stretch his injured side. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles, the landscape growing increasingly wild and remote. Lillian guided the wagon into a sheltered canyon where a small stream provided fresh water. "We'll rest here for a few hours," she decided, helping Vaughn down from the wagon. He moved more easily now, the wound healing clean. In the growing light, Lillian noticed how his eyes took in their surroundings with the practiced vigilance of a man accustomed to watching his back. "You've been quiet," she observed as they shared a simple breakfast of jerky and biscuits. "Having regrets about dragging me into this?" Vaughn looked at her directly. "More than you know, but also." He hesitated, searching for words. "I'm not used to anyone standing beside me. Been alone a long time." "How long have you been a bounty hunter?" Lillian asked, curious about the man she'd risked everything to help. 5 years. Before that, Texas Ranger for 3. He tossed a stick into the small fire they'd built. Before that, just another cowhand trying to stay fed. Family. A shadow crossed his face. Lost my parents young. Raised by my grandfather until he passed when I was 16. Been on my own since. He glanced at her. "What about you? Any family besides the cousin in Lordsburg?" "There is no cousin in Lordsburg," Lillian admitted with a small smile. "Just a story for anyone asking questions. My mother died when I was born. It was just Pa and me until the fever took him. He taught me medicine, cooking, how to shoot straight, everything he thought I'd need." "He taught you well," Vaughn said softly. "Most women would have turned me over to Calhoun without a second thought. Most women haven't seen what power and greed can do to good people." Lillian poked at the fire. "My father was the only doctor for 50 miles. Treated everyone, regardless of whether they could pay. When the mining company moved in, they brought their own doctor who charged double. Drove my father out of business." Her voice hardened. "Then when the fever came, their fancy doctor left town, and my father worked himself to death caring for those who'd abandoned him." Vaughn was quiet for a moment. "Your father sounds like a good man." "He was the best of men," Lillian agreed. "And he taught me to recognize the difference between those who take and those who give." She looked at him pointedly. "So far, Mr. Blackwood, you seem to be in the latter category, despite your profession." A faint smile touched his lips. "I only hunt those who've earned it. Like Calhoun. Men like him believe they're entitled to whatever they want: land, gold, lives." Vaughn's expression darkened. "I've been tracking him for months. He and his gang robbed a stage last winter, killed the driver and a young woman passenger who fought back. Her father posted the bounty." Lillian's eyes widened. "The sheriff didn't mention murder charges. As I said, Calhoun has friends in high places. Money buys a lot of forgetfulness in territorial courts." Vaughn leaned forward. "But that map, it could be his undoing. If it leads to what he thinks it does, he'll need men, equipment. It would force him into the open. So we find the mine first," Lillian concluded. Vaughn stared at her. "We? Lillian, I plan to get you somewhere safe, then continue alone." She crossed her arms. "And where exactly is safe, with the law and outlaws both looking for us? Besides, I know these mountains better than you. My father and I explored them for medicinal plants. It's too dangerous, more dangerous than going back to my diner where Calhoun is probably waiting." Lillian challenged. "I've already lost my home, Mr. Blackwood. I'm not turning back now." Their eyes locked in silent battle, neither willing to yield. Finally, Vaughn shook his head with a reluctant smile. "You might be the most stubborn woman I've ever met." "I'll take that as a compliment," Lillian replied, standing to douse the fire. "Now, which way to this mine of yours?" They set out again by mid-morning, leaving the wagon hidden in the canyon and continuing on horseback. Agnes was strong enough to carry them both, though Vaughn insisted Lillian ride while he walked alongside, leading the mare through the increasingly difficult terrain. According to Vaughn's memory of the map, the abandoned mine lay in a secluded valley accessible only through a narrow pass. By his reckoning, they were still 2 days' journey from their destination, assuming they could find the landmarks described. As they traveled, Lillian found herself studying Vaughn when he wasn't looking, the set of his shoulders, the careful way he scanned their surroundings, the occasional wince when his wound troubled him. He was unlike any man she'd known, carrying a quiet strength that commanded respect without demanding it. By late afternoon, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, and Vaughn suggested they find shelter for the night. They discovered an overhang of rock that would provide some protection from the elements, and made camp as the first fat raindrops began to fall. We should reach Miller's Creek by tomorrow afternoon, Vaughn said as they huddled beneath the rocky shelter, watching the rain transform the landscape into a blur of gray. From there, it's another day to the valley. Thunder rolled across the sky, making Agnes snort nervously. Lillian stroked the mare's neck, soothing her. "What will you do if we find the gold?" she asked. Vaughn was silent for a moment, watching the storm. "Turn the map over to the territorial authorities. Make sure Calhoun faces justice for his crimes." He glanced at her. "What would you do?" Lillian hadn't considered the question before. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never thought much about gold or riches. The diner was enough. And now, with the diner gone." She wrapped her arms around her knees. "I suppose I'll start over somewhere. That's what women like me do." "Women like you?" Vaughn asked, his voice gentle. "Women alone," Lillian clarified. "We adapt. Find a way forward." "You don't have to be alone," Vaughn said quietly. The words hung between them, charged with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Lillian felt her cheeks warm despite the cool air. "Let's focus on surviving first," she said, echoing her words from the night before. "Then we can worry about the future." The storm intensified, the rain creating a curtain around their small shelter. In the close confines, Lillian was acutely aware of Vaughn beside her, his warmth, his scent of leather and pine, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Despite the danger that followed them, she felt oddly safe in his presence. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. They shared the single blanket Lillian had packed, sitting close for warmth. "Tell me about Texas," Lillian said to break the intimate silence. "I've never been farther east than Santa Fe." Vaughn's expression softened with memory. "Parts of it are as flat as a board you can see for miles in any direction. Other parts have rolling hills that turn green after the spring rains." His voice took on a wistful quality. "My grandfather's ranch was small, but the land was good. Had a creek running through it where I learned to swim." "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But after he died, there wasn't much holding me there." The neighboring rancher had been eyeing the land for years. Offered to buy it for half what it was worth. His jaw tightened. "When I refused, accidents started happening. Fences cut, cattle scattered." "So you left?" Lillian guessed. Vaughn nodded. "Sold it for what I could get and moved on. Learned pretty quick that in this world, you either take or get taken from." "That's a hard way to live," Lillian observed. "It's the only way I've known." He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the dim light. Until recently, Lillian felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who had both lost too much too young. On impulse, she reached for his hand, finding it cold despite the shared blanket. "Your hands are freezing," she murmured, enclosing his larger hand between her own. "Yours are like fire," he replied, his voice rough. "You're a marvel, Lillian Hayes." She laughed softly. "For having warm hands. For everything." His gaze held hers. "For helping a stranger. For leaving your home behind. For facing down Calhoun without flinching." "Anyone would have done the same," she demurred. "No," Vaughn said firmly. "They wouldn't. Most would have turned me over to save themselves." The conviction in his voice startled her. How many betrayals had this man endured to believe so firmly in human selfishness? "Not everyone is looking to take advantage, Vaughn," she said gently. "Some people help because it's the right thing to do. People like you," he acknowledged. "Rare as desert rain." The compliment warmed her more than the blanket. Outside, the storm began to subside, the thunder growing distant. Exhaustion crept over Lillian as the day's tension slowly released its hold. "You should rest," Vaughn suggested, noticing her heavy eyelids. "I'll keep watch." "Wake me in a few hours," she insisted. "You need sleep too." She settled against the rock wall, trying to find a comfortable position on the hard ground. After a moment's hesitation, Vaughn shifted closer, offering his shoulder as a pillow. Lillian accepted gratefully, the solid warmth of him more comforting than she cared to admit. As she drifted toward sleep, she felt his arm come around her protectively, and for the first time since leaving her diner, Lillian felt she might have found something worth more than what she'd left behind. Dawn broke clear and crisp after the storm, painting the desert in hues of gold and rose. Lillian woke to find herself still nestled against Vaughn, his arm around her shoulders, his breathing deep and even in sleep. Somehow during the night, Their positions had shifted until they were properly embracing, the blanket wrapped around them both. She remained still, unwilling to disturb his rest or the unexpected peace of the moment. In sleep, the vigilance left his features, revealing a younger man than he appeared when awake. A man who might have led a different life under different circumstances. When Vaughn finally stirred, his eyes opening to find her watching him, a moment of unguarded tenderness passed between them before awareness returned. "I was supposed to keep watch," he said, straightening with a grimace for his stiff muscles. "We both needed the rest," Lillian replied, rising to stretch her own aching limbs. "Besides, Agnes would have alerted us to any visitors." They broke camp efficiently, sharing the last of their bread and jerky before continuing their journey. The storm had left the trail muddy in places, slowing their progress, but by midday they reached Miller's Creek, a ribbon of clear water cutting through the rocky landscape. Vaughn studied their surroundings, referring to his mental map. "We follow the creek upstream for about 5 miles, then look for a rock formation shaped like a wolf's head. There should be a trail leading east from there." They made good time along the creek, Agnes picking her way carefully over the rocky ground. The landscape grew increasingly dramatic, with towering cliffs and deep ravines speaking to the violent geological forces that had shaped this rugged corner of the territory. Shortly after noon, they paused to rest and water the horse. As Lillian knelt by the creek to refill their canteens, a movement across the water caught her eye, a flash of color against the rocks. "Vaughn," she whispered urgently, not moving. "Someone's watching us." He was at her side instantly, hand on his gun. "Where?" "Across the creek, behind those boulders." Vaughn scanned the area, his expression grave. "Get back to Agnes." Slowly, before they could move, a voice called out, "That won't be necessary. If I wanted to shoot you, I'd have done it already." A figure emerged from behind the rocks, an older man with weathered skin and gray streaked hair, dressed in buckskins and carrying a rifle that he pointedly kept lowered. "Name's Luther Walsh," the man announced. "And you folks are trespassing on my hunting grounds." Vaughn kept his hand near his gun. "We're just passing through, Mr. Walsh. No intention of hunting your game." The man's shrewd eyes assessed them. Pretty far from anywhere to be just passing through, especially with a wounded man and a lady. He nodded toward Vaughn's side, where a small bloodstain had seeped through his shirt. "We're heading to Lordsburg," Lillian said smoothly, "taking the back way to avoid trouble on the main road." Luther snorted. "Back way to Lordsburg would be 50 miles south of here. Try again, miss." Vaughn and Lillian exchanged glances. The old hunter had them cornered, but he didn't seem immediately hostile. "We're looking for something," Vaughn admitted carefully. "Something that might be better left unfound, according to some." Luther's expression sharpened with interest. "You wouldn't be looking for old Eduardo's mine, would you?" Surprise registered on both their faces before they could hide it. The old man chuckled. "Thought so. You ain't the first to come looking. Won't be the last, neither." He gestured to a narrow path leading upward. "My cabin's half a mile yonder. If you're aiming to find that mine, you might want to hear what I know first." Vaughn remained cautious. "How do we know we can trust you?" Luther shrugged. "Don't reckon you do. But I've been in these mountains 40 years, and I'm still breathing. That ought to count for something." He turned and began walking away. Coming or not. After a brief, whispered consultation, they decided to follow. If Luther had wanted to harm them, he'd had ample opportunity. Besides, local knowledge might prove invaluable in finding the mine and avoiding Calhoun's men. Luther's cabin was a solid structure of logs and stone, built against a cliff face with a commanding view of the valley below. Inside was surprisingly comfortable, with handmade furniture, shelves of books, and animal skins covering the plank floor. "Sit," Luther instructed, gesturing to chairs around a rough-hewn table. "You look like you could use a hot meal." While the old hunter prepared a stew of rabbit and wild onions, he shared what he knew of the Spanish mine. According to Luther, the mine had been abandoned after an Apache raid in the late 1700s. Local legend held that the Spaniards had discovered an unusually rich vein of gold, but had been slaughtered before they could fully exploit it. "Over the years, folks have come looking," Luther explained, ladling stew into wooden bowls. "Some find nothing. Some never come back at all." "You believe the mine exists?" Vaughn asked, accepting a bowl gratefully. Luther nodded. "Oh, it exists all right. Found it myself 20 years back." Wasn't much to see collapsed entrance, old tools rusted to nothing. He fixed Vaughn with a penetrating stare. But that ain't what folks are really after, is it? What do you mean? Lillian asked. The treasure room, Luther said simply. Story goes the Spaniards hid their processed gold in a separate chamber, sealed it up when the Apaches attacked. That's what your friend Calhoun is after, I'd wager. Vaughn tensed. You know Calhoun? Know of him, Luther corrected. His reputation precedes him. And I saw his men riding through the valley yesterday. 6 of them, well armed, asking questions at every homestead. He gave them a significant look. They're closing in. The news sent a chill through Lillian. 6 men, now 1 more than Vaughn had mentioned. They were outnumbered and outgunned. If you found the mine once, could you find it again? She asked Luther. The old man hesitated. Could. Question is, should I? He studied them both. What's your stake in this? You don't strike me as treasure hunters. Vaughn explained about the bounty on Calhoun, the murdered stage passengers, and his plan to use the mine as bait to bring the outlaw to justice. Luther listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if confirming something to himself. When Vaughn finished, Luther rose and moved to a trunk in the corner of the cabin. He returned with a folded piece of deerskin, which he spread on the table. On it was drawn a crude but detailed map. Made this after I found the place, he explained. Never had much use for gold myself, but information is always valuable. His finger traced a path through the mountains. It's here, about a day's journey from my cabin. But the trail is treacherous narrow paths, loose rocks. One wrong step could send you to Kingdom Come. Why would you help us? Vaughn asked, suspicion still evident in his voice. Luther's weathered face hardened. Because 15 years ago, Isaiah Calhoun and his brother killed my trapping partner for the pelts we'd spent all winter collecting. Law did nothing. His eyes met Vaughn's. If you're aiming to bring him down, I'll help however I can. The revelation cemented their unlikely alliance. They spent the remainder of the day planning, with Luther providing invaluable details about the terrain and possible approaches to the mine. By evening, they had formulated a strategy. Luther would guide them to the mine the following day, where they would assess whether the treasure room actually existed and, if so, prepare an ambush for Calhoun. That night, Luther insisted they take his bed while he slept near the fire. Despite their protests, the old hunter was adamant. Been sleeping on the ground most of my life, he said gruffly. One more night won't kill me. Alone in the small bedroom, Lillian and Vaughn faced each other awkwardly. I can sleep on the floor, Vaughn offered immediately. Lillian shook her head. Don't be ridiculous. Your wound is still healing. Besides, she felt heat rise to her cheeks. We've already shared closer quarters than this. The reminder of their night under the rock overhang hung between them. Vaughn cleared his throat. That was different. We had no choice. And we do now. Lillian challenged softly. Would it be so terrible to admit that perhaps we both found comfort in each other's presence? Vaughn's expression softened. No, he admitted. Not terrible at all. They settled onto the narrow bed, initially maintaining a careful distance between them. But as the night deepened and the cabin grew cool, they gravitated toward each other's warmth until Lillian found herself curled against Vaughn's side, his arm around her waist. I keep thinking about what happens after, she whispered into the darkness. If we find the gold, if we capture Calhoun, what then? Vaughn was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. Finally, he said, I've been a hunter of men for so long. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else. That's not true, Lillian countered. You were a rancher before. You could be again. Land costs money. And we might be about to find a Spanish treasure, she reminded him with a small laugh. His hand found hers beneath the blanket, fingers intertwining. And you? What will you do? Rebuild my diner, perhaps. Somewhere new. She hesitated, then added, somewhere with good grazing land nearby, maybe. The implication wasn't lost on Vaughn. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. That sounds like a fine plan, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Neither spoke again, but something profound had shifted between them, tentative plans for a future neither had dared imagine before. Morning arrived with a sense of purpose. Luther served a breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried apples before they set out, leaving Agnes at the cabin and proceeding on foot. The terrain was too treacherous for horseback, the old hunter explained, and they'd move more quietly without the animal. They traveled light, carrying only weapons, water, and some basic provisions. Luther led them through a maze of canyons and ridges, following landmarks only he could recognize. By midday, they had climbed to a vantage point that overlooked a hidden valley ringed by steep cliffs. There, Luther pointed to a dark opening halfway up the opposite cliff face. That's the mine entrance. Vaughn studied it through a small spyglass. Looks intact from here. Outer tunnel is, Luther confirmed. It's the interior that's collapsed in places. We'll need to proceed carefully. They made their way down into the valley and across to the base of the cliff. A narrow, switchback trail led upward to the mine entrance, barely visible unless one knew exactly where to look. This is why it's remained hidden, Luther explained as they began the ascent. Spaniards chose the location deliberately, easy to defend against intruders. The climb was arduous, with loose rocks threatening to give way beneath their feet. Lillian found herself grateful for her practical attire. She'd long ago adapted to wearing split skirts that allowed for easier movement in the rugged terrain. When they finally reached the entrance, they paused to catch their breath. The opening was partially obscured by vegetation that had grown over the centuries, but behind it yawned a dark tunnel leading into the mountain. Luther produced 3 candles from his pack, lighting them. Stay close. Watch your footing. The tunnel extended about 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber where evidence of mining operations remained: rotted support beams, rusted tools, even the skeletal remains of what might have been a mine cart. Luther pointed out crudely carved symbols on the walls. Spanish markers, he explained. Warnings about cave-ins, directions to different tunnels. Vaughn examined the chamber carefully. Where would this treasure room be? Luther gestured to a partially collapsed tunnel leading deeper into the mountain. According to legend, through there. Never ventured that far myself. Too unstable. Vaughn approached the tunnel, holding his candle high. Looks passable, if we're careful. Vaughn, Lillian cautioned, is it worth the risk? We found the mine. We could still use it to lure Calhoun. He turned to her, determination in his eyes. If there's no gold, he'll have no reason to show himself. We need to know for certain. After a brief debate, they agreed that Vaughn and Luther would explore the inner tunnel while Lillian kept watch at the entrance. The men proceeded cautiously, testing each step before committing their weight, while Lillian returned to the mine opening, positioning herself where she could observe both the approach trail and the valley below. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, creating patterns of light and dark that made it difficult to distinguish movement. Lillian found herself jumping at every flutter of birds' wings or rustle of wind through scrub brush. After what seemed an eternity, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Vaughn emerging from the tunnel, his face streaked with dirt and something else: excitement. It's there, he said breathlessly. The treasure room, just as the legend described. Luther appeared behind him, looking equally amazed. Never seen anything like it. Chamber carved right into the rock, sealed with a stone door. Inside, stacks of ingots, coins, artifacts, more gold than I've seen in all my years. Enough to tempt Calhoun? Lillian asked. Vaughn nodded grimly. Enough to tempt an army. We need to prepare. He won't be far behind us. They spent the remaining daylight hours formulating their plan. The narrow approach to the mine provided a natural bottleneck. Anyone coming up the trail would be exposed to fire from above. They positioned themselves strategically, Luther at a higher point with his rifle, Vaughn near the entrance, and Lillian inside the first chamber with the shotgun. As dusk fell, Luther spotted movement in the valley below. Through the spyglass, Vaughn confirmed their worst fears. Calhoun, he said tersely, and all 6 of his men. They're making camp for the night. They'll come at dawn, Luther predicted. Try to catch us sleeping. None of them slept that night. They took turns watching, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. During one such watch, Lillian found Vaughn standing at the mine entrance, staring out at the star-filled sky. Having second thoughts? She asked softly, joining him. He shook his head, just wondering if this is how it ends one way or another. It doesn't have to end, Lillian said, touching his arm. This could be a beginning. Vaughn turned to face her, his expression solemn in the moonlight. Lillian, if anything happens tomorrow, she pressed her fingers to his lips. Don't. We're going to succeed. Calhoun will face justice, and then. She trailed off, not wanting to presume. Vaughn caught her hand, holding it against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. "And then I'd like to see about that diner with good grazing land nearby," he finished for her. The simple declaration stole her breath. Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her gently at first, then with growing intensity as she responded in kind. It was a promise, a declaration, a moment of connection amid danger. When they finally parted, Lillian kept her hand over his heart. "Then we both have something to fight for tomorrow." Dawn broke with the stillness that often precedes violence. From their vantage point, they watched as Calhoun's men began their approach, moving with the confidence of predators who believe their prey is unaware. "They're splitting up," Luther whispered, observing through his spyglass. "Two staying below as lookouts, 5 heading up the trail. Calhoun's with them." Vaughn checked his weapons one final time. "Remember, we want Calhoun alive if possible. He needs to stand trial for his crimes." They fell silent as the outlaws made their way up the switchback trail. Calhoun led the group, followed by his men in single file due to the narrow path. When they were halfway up, Luther gave the signal. The crack of his rifle shattered the morning quiet. The last man in line clutched his chest and toppled backward off the trail, falling to the rocks below. Immediately, the outlaws scattered for what little cover the trail offered, returning fire blindly toward the mine entrance. "Hold your positions," Vaughn called to his companions. "Let them come to us." For several minutes, gunfire echoed through the valley as Calhoun's men tried unsuccessfully to advance. One made a dash forward only to be felled by Vaughn's precise shot. The remaining 3, including Calhoun, took refuge behind a rocky outcropping just below the final approach to the mine. "They're pinned down," Luther reported. "But so are we. And those 2 at the bottom could be working their way around." Vaughn considered their options. "We need to draw them out. Make them think we're vulnerable." "I'll go," Lillian volunteered. "I can circle behind them using that ledge." She pointed to a narrow shelf of rock that extended around the cliff face. "Absolutely not," Vaughn objected. "It's too dangerous." "I'm the lightest," she countered. "And they won't be expecting me. They'll be watching for you too." After heated debate, they reluctantly agreed it was their best chance. Lillian would work her way around to a position above and behind the outlaws while Vaughn and Luther provided covering fire to keep them occupied. Lillian removed her boots for better grip and began her precarious journey along the rock ledge, clutching the cliff face for support. The path was barely wide enough for her feet, and a wrong step meant certain death on the rocks far below. She moved slowly, testing each foothold, trying to steady her breathing against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Behind her, the gunfire intensified as Vaughn and Luther executed their part of the plan, keeping Calhoun's attention directed toward the mine entrance. Inch by painstaking inch, Lillian made her way around the curve of the cliff until she was positioned above the outlaws' hiding place. From her vantage point, she could see Calhoun and his 2 remaining men crouched behind the rocks, periodically firing toward the mine. Taking a deep breath, she raised the pistol Vaughn had given her and fired a single shot into the air. The unexpected gunfire from behind startled the outlaws. One man spun around, exposing himself momentarily, and was immediately cut down by Luther's rifle. Calhoun and his remaining henchmen returned fire toward Lillian, forcing her to press herself against the cliff face for cover. In the chaos, Vaughn emerged from the mine entrance and charged down the trail, taking advantage of the distraction. He tackled Calhoun's companion before the man could react, sending them both crashing to the ground in a desperate struggle. Calhoun, seeing his opportunity, broke cover and raced toward Lillian's position, apparently recognizing her as the more vulnerable target. Terror shot through her as she realized she was trapped on the narrow ledge with nowhere to retreat. As Calhoun raised his gun, a shot rang out, and he staggered, clutching his shoulder. Luther had found his mark from his elevated position. Enraged rather than deterred, Calhoun continued his advance, his face contorted with fury. Lillian fired her pistol, but in her haste, the shot went wide. Calhoun reached the base of her ledge and began climbing up, using his uninjured arm to pull himself toward her. "Nowhere to run now, girl," he snarled, blood staining his expensive coat. Below, Vaughn had subdued his opponent and was racing back up the trail, shouting Lillian's name. but he was too far away to reach her in time. With Calhoun nearly upon her and her pistol empty, Lillian made a desperate decision. As the outlaw lunged for her ankle, she kicked free and leapt from the ledge toward a lower shelf of rock several feet away. She landed hard, pain shooting through her ankle, but managed to keep her balance. Calhoun, thrown off by her sudden movement, lost his grip and slid several feet down the cliff face before catching himself. With a roar of frustration, he drew a knife from his boot and prepared to throw it at her. Before he could release the blade, a shot echoed through the canyon, and Calhoun jerked backward, his knife clattering uselessly against the rocks. Vaughn stood on the trail below, his gun still raised. "It's over, Calhoun," he called. "Surrender, or the next one won't be in your leg." For a moment, it seemed the outlaw might still resist. Then, with a grimace of pain and defeat, he lowered his remaining weapon. "This isn't finished, Blackwood," he spat. "Men like me don't stay in jail." "We'll see about that," Vaughn replied, keeping his gun trained on Calhoun as Luther approached with rope to bind the outlaw's hands. Once Calhoun was secured, Vaughn rushed to help Lillian down from her precarious position. Her ankle throbbed with each step, but the pain was forgotten in the relief of survival and victory. "That," Vaughn said as he supported her weight, "was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever witnessed." Lillian managed to smile despite her exhaustion. Perhaps a bit of both. With Calhoun and his surviving henchmen bound and under guard, they made their way back to the mine entrance to rest and tend to their injuries. Luther had sustained a graze to his arm, but insisted it was nothing serious. Lillian's ankle was swollen but not broken, and Vaughn's wound had reopened slightly during his struggle, requiring fresh bandaging. As the adrenaline of battle faded, the reality of their situation settled in. They had captured Isaiah Calhoun, one of the most notorious outlaws in the territory, and discovered a fortune in Spanish gold. The question now was what to do with both. "Silver City's the nearest place with a proper jail," Luther advised. 3 days' journey if we push hard. "And the gold?" Lillian asked, looking toward the inner chamber where the treasure lay undisturbed for centuries. Vaughn's expression was thoughtful. "By rights, it should go to the territorial government, but with proper documentation of its discovery." He glanced at Luther. "There would be a substantial finder's fee. Enough to buy land, start a business." The old hunter nodded in understanding. "I've lived my life in these mountains. Don't need gold to continue doing so." He smiled faintly. "But I wouldn't object to a new rifle and a proper winter coat." They agreed to take only a small portion of the treasure, enough to secure their futures without raising undue suspicion, and report the rest to the authorities once Calhoun was safely imprisoned. The outlaws' remaining men at the base of the cliff had fled upon seeing their leader captured, but they couldn't risk lingering too long in case they returned with reinforcements. By evening, they had made their way back to Luther's cabin, where Agnes greeted them with nervous whinnies. They would rest for the night before beginning the journey to Silver City at first light. As dusk settled over the mountains, Lillian found Vaughn sitting alone on the cabin's small porch, staring at the gold coin he turned between his fingers. "Having regrets?" she asked, lowering herself carefully beside him, mindful of her injured ankle. He shook his head, "Just thinking about how quickly life can change. A week ago, I was bleeding on your doorstep with nothing but a bounty to my name. And now?" Lillian prompted gently. Vaughn closed his fist around the coin, then looked at her directly. "Now I'm sitting here wondering if a certain stubborn woman might consider becoming my partner in more than just outlaw hunting." Lillian's heart quickened. "What kind of partnership did you have in mind, Mr. Blackwood?" He took her hand, his expression solemn yet tender. "The kind that lasts a lifetime, Miss Hayes, if you'd be willing." "That's quite a proposition from a man I've known barely a week," she said, though her voice betrayed her emotion. "I'd say we've lived more in that week than most people do in a year," Vaughn countered. "I know my own mind, Lillian, and my heart." He paused, uncertainty flickering across his face. "But if you need time," she silenced him with a kiss, pouring into it all the feelings that had grown between them through danger and trust and shared purpose. "I don't need time," she whispered when they parted. "I need you." The journey to Silver City was arduous but uneventful. Calhoun and his surviving henchmen were delivered to the territorial marshal, along with sworn statements about their crimes. Vaughn's status as a former Texas Ranger lent credibility to their account, and when they revealed the location of the Spanish mine to the authorities, the resulting excitement overshadowed any questions about their own involvement. As Vaughn had predicted, they were granted a substantial finder's fee for the treasure, enough to purchase a small ranch with good water rights and fertile grazing land just outside a growing settlement in the northern part of the territory. Luther declined their invitation to join them, preferring to return to his solitary life in the mountains, though he promised to visit when the snows drove him to lower elevations. By the following spring, Vaughn and Lillian had established themselves in their new home. The main house was modest but solid, with a wide porch that caught the evening breeze. Behind it stood a smaller building that housed Lillian's new diner, catering to travelers along the stage route that passed nearby. Their wedding had been a simple affair, attended by Luther and a handful of neighbors who had welcomed the newcomers with typical frontier hospitality. Lillian wore her mother's locket and a dress she'd sewn herself, while Vaughn looked uncommonly respectable in a new suit, his ranger's badge pinned to his lapel as a reminder of the man he had been. On a warm evening in May, they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. Vaughn's arm rested comfortably around Lillian's shoulders, her head leaning against him in contented silence. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing the question she had posed to him that night at Luther's cabin. Lillian smiled, taking his hand and placing it over her stomach, where the first subtle swell of new life was beginning to show. "Not a single one." Vaughn's eyes widened, joy and wonder replacing his usual reserve. "Are you certain?" "As certain as a doctor's daughter can be," she confirmed, laughing at his expression. "Come winter, there'll be 3 of us at this table." He pulled her closer, pressing his lips to her hair. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "A home, a family, a future worth fighting for. All because you stumbled bleeding into my diner," Lillian teased, though her own eyes shone with happy tears. "No," Vaughn corrected gently. "All because you poured coffee for a stranger and asked nothing in return." He cupped her face in his hands, his expression solemn. "You saved more than my life that day, Lillian. You saved my soul." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, they remained on the porch, talking softly of their plans for the future, the crops they would plant, the cattle they would raise, the children who might one day play in the yard before them. Their path had been unusual and fraught with danger, but it had led them exactly where they were meant to be. And when customers at Lillian's diner asked how she and her husband had met, she would smile mysteriously and say only that it involved coffee, cowboys, and a little Spanish gold, a story better saved for another time. Years passed, and the small ranch flourished under their care. The diner became known throughout the territory for its excellent food and warm hospitality, often serving as a gathering place for the growing community. Lillian and Vaughn welcomed a son that first winter, a strong boy they named Thomas Luther Blackwood, after both their fathers, and a daughter, Grace, 2 years later. Occasionally, news would reach them of Isaiah Calhoun. He had been sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, but had indeed proven difficult to contain. After an attempted escape that resulted in the death of a guard, his sentence was extended to life. The last they heard, he had died during a prison riot, still cursing the name Blackwood with his final breath. Luther Walsh became a regular visitor, especially after the children were born. The old hunter delighted in teaching young Thomas about tracking and wildlife, and little Grace would sit enraptured as he told carefully edited tales of his adventures in the mountains. Vaughn found his calling raising horses rather than hunting men. His understanding of the animals and fair business practices earned him respect throughout the region, and the Blackwood brand became synonymous with quality. He never again strapped on his gun for bounty, though he kept his skills sharp and occasionally assisted the local sheriff when trouble arose. Lillian expanded her diner to include rooms for travelers, creating a small but respectable inn that provided additional income and connected them to the wider world beyond their valley. She maintained her independence even within marriage, managing her business while Vaughn ran the ranch, their partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, Vaughn surprised Lillian with a special gift, a silver coffee pot engraved with the words that had changed both their lives. "No one's ever fed me and asked nothing in return. You never did tell me why you helped me that day," Vaughn said as they sat by the fire that evening, the children asleep upstairs. "A wounded stranger with trouble on his heels. Most would have turned me away." Lillian considered the question, though she had pondered it many times over the years. "I saw something in your eyes," she finally answered. "Beneath the pain and weariness, there was honor. And perhaps I was tired of being alone, of watching life pass by my window without being part of it." Vaughn took her hand, his thumb tracing the simple gold band he had placed there a decade ago. "Whatever your reason, I thank God for it every day." "As do I," Lillian replied softly. "Who would have thought that a cup of coffee could lead to all this?" As they looked around their home at the photographs of their children, the books and keepsakes that told the story of their life together, the windows that framed their land stretching toward the mountains, they shared a smile of quiet wonder. Their journey had begun with a desperate encounter in a roadside diner, but it had led to something precious and enduring, a love as vast as the western sky and as steadfast as the mountains that had witnessed their beginning. And when travelers stopped at their inn, weary from the road and hungry for more than just food, Lillian would pour their coffee with a knowing smile, understanding that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the simplest acts of kindness.